Alice's backstory, full of betrayal and twists, is every bit as fascinating as her character suggests. To date, she remains a fan favorite, and I certainly adore her above any of the other Cullens. Her bubbly manner, her determination, and her almost endearing flaws have charmed many a reader, including those not as impressed with the rest of the saga. Of course, if Alice as a character is interesting, her origins are even more so. Her story is touched upon in the novel, but much of the details are lost because even Alice herself doesn't know her story. In exploring her myth, we'll look at the facts and tragedies even Alice continues to remain, perhaps blessedly, unaware of. Before we continue, I'm Riley and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I obsess over fantasy novels and offer the odd bit of writing advice. If you like hearing about your favorite characters, or exploring the mythology behind the likes of Hogwarts or the Valkyrie, hit that subscribe button. I post on Fridays, and I promise not to bite, even if I'd love to be a vampire. Alice was born Mary Alice Brandon in the year 1901, though she preferred to go by her middle name, Alice. She was 19 when she was transformed into a vampire in the year 1920. Alice has her own set of degrees. She has studied fashion and international business. Her ability to see the future also enables her to boost the family fortunes by seeing the results of the stock market. She both loves buying and designing clothes. Her choice of car is as loud and bright as she is. A yellow Porsche 911 Turbo, what she fell in love with after driving a stolen model in Italy. The perky vampire's origin begins in Biloxi, Mississippi, where Alice was the older sister in a middle-class household. She was close to her sister, Cynthia, though there was a considerable age gap of 9 years between them. Alice's human father was a jeweler and a pearl trader. He bought the pearls from divers and then sold them for an increased rate on the mainland. As such, his work would take him away from his family for several days at a time, and the family, in order to support themselves, also had the collective responsibility of tending an orchard. Alice always had the gift of premonition, though as a human she usually felt, rather than saw, what was about to happen, with exceptions as she grew older. When she was a little girl, it was easy for the family to find Alice's ability cute. On a sunny day, she would don a raincoat, and rain would follow. If she said Grandma was coming for a surprise visit, the family would make a point of setting out an extra plate. Unfortunately, Alice's predictions could be incorrect, especially when it came to actual people and their changing minds, but weather was generally easier to predict. In understanding Alice's abilities, it's important to note that what she predicts is based on the decisions of others. If someone changes their choice, the future will shift and Alice can find herself wrong. By the age of 10, Alice was beginning to keep her predictions to herself. Of course, the few predictions she did make were enough to ostracize her from her peers, and gossip spread through the local community when it came to her talents. She earned the label of the uncanny child of the Brandons, and Alice's doting mother, concerned for her daughter, urged Alice to keep her premonitions to herself. At 18, though struggling to keep quiet, Alice still made enough predictions to cause trouble for herself. She predicted one of her friends, a young woman, would marry to her detriment. Alice also predicted that one of her cousins would meet with misfortune if he chose to travel west. Both parties ignored Alice's misgivings and accordingly met bad fates. It was learned that, for her friend and her marriage, the husband's family had a history of insanity. As for Alice's cousin, whom she'd always been close to, he died in an accident along the road. In these instances, Alice was blamed for the poor outcomes, accused of cursing or jinxing each person respectively. Though it was the 1900s, Alice's abilities still engendered superstition, and names like witch and changeling were used to describe Alice. Alice's abilities continued to show her a darker side, and she had the worst of her predictions when she had a literal vision of a man murdering her mother in the woods. Thankfully, Alice's mother heeded her warnings. She made a point of going out only when necessary, but Alice's father, Mr. Brandon, was less than impressed with what he referred to as Alice's damned stories. Despite Mr. Brandon's irritation, Mrs. Brandon tried to listen to Alice and take precautions. When Mrs. Brandon had to go out, she carried a pistol with her. Mr. Brandon, meanwhile, remained both angry and dismissive of what he called Alice's hysteria. Furthermore, with nothing happening as a result of her precautions, Mrs. Brandon grew complacent. After a month, she rejoined her sewing circle and socialized with friends. One day, Mrs. Brandon went out, and Alice had a true vision. She saw not only the murderer himself, but how he would kill her mother. Driving a Model T, he would run Mrs. Brandon off the road. Alice saw not only her mother's buggy being hit, but the man checking his intended victim was dead before fleeing. Even knowing she was too late, Alice sped to the scene of the crime. The death was declared an accident, and with no other proof beyond a vision, Alice's claims that Mrs. Brandon's death was a case of foul play were dismissed. Within 6 months, Mr. Brandon remarried, choosing for his bride a younger woman who was only 10 years older than Alice. This new bride doted on Cynthia, but was cold towards Alice. The new Mrs. Brandon made a number of strange remarks in Alice's hearing. These comments, in combination with knowledge that the wedding had been in the works for considerable time, made Alice suspicious. When she tried to confide in Mr. Brandon, Alice was again furiously dismissed. Before long, Alice had yet another vision. Her father was exchanging money with the man Alice recognized as having run her mother off the road. This led immediately into another vision concerning Alice herself. Having taken the money, the man would stab Alice to death. Alice fled to her aunt and uncle's home, banging on the door upon her arrival. Yet she was not met with compassion. They still blamed her for the death of her cousin, and her seemingly wild story that her father had murdered her mother and had plans to kill her next did not endear her to them. Threatening to set the dogs on Alice, they drove her away. Alice went to the marshals, but her father and aunt were waiting there for her. The marshal bought their story that Alice was mad, and he took a hefty bribe to have Alice shoved into an asylum outside of their immediate area. As far as the rest of the community was concerned, the Brandons pretended Alice had died, and her accusations against both her father and stepmother were swept under the rug. A typhoid fever broke out in the asylum where Alice was placed, and consequently, she was shaved bald. Subjected to electroshock therapy, the brutal treatment caused Alice to lose her memory. The silver lining in this is that she also forgot any of the tragedies she'd suffered, which allowed her to regain something of her former cheerfulness. A vampire worked as a groundskeeper at the asylum. If he drank blood from its inmates, nobody would miss them or suspect anything was amiss. However, when it came to Alice, he refrained from hurting her. He protected her from further shock therapy when he could, among other horrors, and he played a kind of game with her, having her predict which objects he brought with him when he visited. He could tell Alice had a special talent. Alice had a vision of another vampire coming to kill her. This vampire was none other than James, a self-proclaimed tracker who would later hunt down Bella Swan. In assessing the future, Alice knew fleeing was not an option. James would inevitably find her. Only being transformed herself could save her, but the chances of returning in time were still low. The groundskeeper bit Alice and hid her. Even knowing he would die, he waited to face James. If he could buy Alice enough time to transform, James would have no reason to pursue her. As with the electroshock therapy, the pain of becoming a vampire again erased Alice's memory. She had no recollection of the caring vampire who had sacrificed his existence for her. She didn't even have any memory of being human. Her new existence as a vampire, alone in the world, was all she knew. The reason why she was a vampire would remain a mystery to her. Alice's augmented psychic talents saved her, allowing her to make the choices which would be most beneficial to her. She saw Jasper and knew they'd be together, but she made the choice to wait, knowing he wasn't yet ready to meet her. She also began abstaining from human blood. Though she hadn't met Carlisle yet, the knowledge she would someday join his family prompted her to embrace his lifestyle. She wasn't perfect, but eventually she managed to maintain the vegetarian diet. Come 1948, Alice headed to the Philadelphia diner where she knew Jasper would be. Though their meet-cute was unusual, to say the least, Jasper's own ability to feel the emotions of others enabled him to feel not only Alice's sincerity, but the love she already had for him. Alice led Jasper in abstaining from human blood that they might be prepared to join the Cullen clan in 1950. Though Alice mastered this diet, Jasper would continue to struggle with it for decades to come. In joining the family, Alice's friendship with Edward was the greatest. After all, with his ability to read minds, he could empathize best with her experience of seeing or hearing that which others couldn't. He also remained the only family member who could play a fair game of chess with Alice. When it comes to not only her personality, but her backstory, Alice is my favorite Coven member. Despite everything she's been through, she remains one of the cheeriest vampires around. She's easy to love, and I have to wonder how books following her perspective would have played out. Who is your favorite character in the series? Would you want to see a story told from Alice's perspective? Sound off in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and happy reading.